Yo, what's going on, guys? So in the past few weeks I've been asked the question, how do I edit my Instagram photos? So today I thought I'd cover exactly how I do that. And I do use presets. I have them online on my website. You could find them in the description. These presets aren't a one-time click sort of thing. They're a foundation for your editing process where you could build off the colors and the tones. So let's get right into it. So we can click on tutorials, we can click on the plus sign, create collection, and then we'll name it number 2. I like to do this to keep all my photos organized by location, time frame. It's all personal preference. So we'll go to import, and you can drag and drop, which is usually what I do, or you can go into the source and you can click on the file that you want. So for now we'll just do this since it's right there on the desktop. When it's usually in my hard drive, I'll drag and drop it. So we'll import, Command A, drag and drop into number 2. So now we have our photos. And as you can see, some of the Gopro photos aren't in the right orientation. So you can use these 2 arrows to rotate it before we start editing it. So there we go. And then we'll click on develop to get straight into the editing. You can see that the sun is just falling over the mountains and in the hills in the background. So we can go up to here and bump up the exposure just to get the foreground set up. We can bring up the contrast a bit. Drop the highlights because we don't want the background to be too harsh. Bring up the shadows a tiny bit. Bring up the whites, the hair, and then let's see. Do I want the blacks down? Actually, I want the blacks up and the shadows down. And then let's make it a little bit warmer, since it is later in the afternoon. Vibrance up, saturation down, then we'll go down to clarity, make that soft. We'll do the tone curve again. In the tone curve, these dots here represent shadows, and then the blacks, midtones, highlights, and whites. And you can see that there's our histogram that matches up here. So we have a lot of white that drops off, and then we have a bunch of midtones and not as many shadows. That's a good tool to learn. You go up to hue, mess with the red a bit, mess with the orange. Don't really want to mess with that blue because it messes with the background. But I will drop the saturation on it, which is how much of the color shows through. So if I want the saturation or a lot of the blue to show through, I'll bump it up to 100, but I won't because it doesn't look nice. If I want it to show through, I'll put it to like 25, around there. But I don't want too much of it, so I'll bump that down. Mess with the yellows in here. And then we can go down to split toning, and then do the same thing. So colder highlights, warmer shadows. And I could bring it over again. And there's a before and after. So we kind of have a filmy, soft look to this. And then what we could do is use the graduated filter right here. Is that what it's called? Yeah, graduated filter. And we can add some contrast to the foreground, bring down the highlights, bring up the shadows, or bring up the blacks and then drop the shadows. We could bring that up a bit just so our foreground isn't taking over the image and our eye is drawn naturally to Madison, Shawn, and Weston standing there. And you could also use the radial filter, and you could draw on a little circle. You can hold Alt and click on Effect, which will make it to reset if you hold down Alt to reset this. And then you can come down, feather it, invert the mask, and then we can mess with what's inside the circle. So I'll only do a little bit because I don't want too much of this to stand out, but just enough so that you can put an emphasis on a certain location in the image. So there we go. And then we can go down to the vignette, drop that down a bit, enable profile corrections, and do the vignette a little bit more. And there we are. Now for the GoPro photos. This one, I made a preset called Powder Day 2016. And on every single Powder Day photo I've ever taken, once I apply it, boom, it's done. And with this effect, you can go on my website and you can download one of the packs that comes with the Powder Day, Sunset, 2016 Snow. It comes with an assortment of, I think, about 10 items. But as you can see, I like to bring up the exposure, the highlights, the blacks and the shadows and whites. So I can have the darker colors, such as the riders in the background, pop through, and then the white in the background, add some contrast to it. And the tone curve isn't as exaggerated. Here's the saturation, hue, and the luminance. In the split toning, you can see that the highlights are warm, the shadows are cold, and the balance is brought to the left to make it cooler. But if I bring it to the right, it'll be warmer. It doesn't look right. But having a little bit of warmth in the background and sometimes in the foreground in the snow to make it look nice. And then GoPro Sunset. If I click on Sunset Beach, boom, it's done. But let's go through this one, see if we can recreate it. So I know that I want the image to be a little bit warmer, so I'll go up to temperature, and then go up to exposure, bump up the contrast. And I'm going through this pretty fast because it's a fast process. Once you get the hang of it, it's all repetition. So at the beginning I went a little bit slower so you could see what's what, but now I'm showing you how fast it actually is when you go through and edit this stuff. So I want the foreground and the pier to be a little bit darker, so I'll bring down the blacks, but then I want the film in the water to be a little bit brighter. So go on vibrance, drop down saturation, do the tone curve. The tone curve is huge. Without it, kind of a flatter image. And then go up to saturation, bring up the orange, and then with the GoPro photos, when I bring up orange, I'll usually bring down the yellow, just so they're not fighting each other. You go up to luminance, brighten up orange, darken the yellow, bring up the blues, even though there's not too much in there. Split toning, we'll do the highlights warm and the shadows cool. Then we'll bring it down to the cool side. Then we can use the graduated filter to add some brightness to the foreground. We'll bring up the saturation of hair, contrast up, highlights up, blacks down, shadows up, whites up. Actually, blacks not that far down. So there's that. And then we can go down to sharpening, sharpen it up a bit. Profile corrections, we don't really need it, but you can put it on there, even though I shot on the Hero 5 with linear mode, which takes away the wide angle distortion. Add a little bit of vignette, and then we could crop it up a bit where you can see the horizon line is a little bit sideways. So you can click on this guy right here, drop down in the middle, and then we can pull it to the side or rotate it, make sure that it's all level. Click enter, and there you go. There's the before and there's the after. Then this guy, we took this out in the Alabama hills, and it's a little bit darker, and it wasn't as colorful, or the lighting wasn't as nice as we wanted. So we could start off by bumping up the exposure and bring up the contrast, bring up the highlights, bring up the shadows, bring up the blacks, drop the whites, and then drop the shadows a bit. Once we already brought up the blacks, I realized I don't want the shadows on there. Bump up the vibrance, drop down the saturation, and then you do this. Clip the whites, crush the blacks. So now already in those few steps we went from a dark, kind of crappy image to a nice, brighter but softer image. And then we can go down into the HSL, mess with the hue. I don't want to mess with the orange too much because that's my skin tone. Mess with the red a bit. The yellow we can make a little bit orange, and then we can brighten all this. So we can make the yellows a little bit brighter, red a bit darker. add some saturation to my skin, desaturate the yellow. Then we can go into split tone, and then shadows, and add just enough so we can have a little bit of a warmer tone to it. Sharpening's on 25. Enable profile corrections, and then add a vignette. And there we go. There's a finished product. And then we'll skip over this one since we've already done a few DSLRs. And then here's another GoPro photo. And GoPro photos are one of my favorite photos to color correct because of how easy they are and how beautiful they are straight out of the camera. So we can go straight to exposure to brighten up the image, add contrast, add highlights, shadows, bring the blacks down, bring the whites up, vibrance up, saturation down. You can do the blacks down, midtones up. So blacks not that far down. Saturation, I want my bindings to stick out a little bit more. So we'll bring up the red, we'll bring up the orange for the background, bring up the yellows, bring up the blues. Then we'll go straight to split tone, make it a little bit cooler. Then we'll bring it about here, bring that down. Sharpening, I always shoot on low in my settings, so I want the sharpening to be brought up higher because I'd rather do it in post rather than have a sharper image straight out of the camera when I can have full control outside of that. Enable profile corrections, and add a tiny bit of vignette, and there we go. So I hope you guys enjoyed this beginner's tutorial. Let me know what you guys thought down below. I plan on making a more advanced tutorial when you start using the spot reduction tool, the graduated filter, the radial filter, and we can start manipulating our images more. So see you guys in the next one. Take care. Peace.